Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to give you a brief welcome before we get started. I'm Maya Elenevsky, the Events and Outreach Manager here at the Center for Contemplative Mind in Society with the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education. The ACMHE is a multidisciplinary academic association with a membership of over 700 educators, staff, students, and researchers committed to the transformation of higher education through contemplative methods. The ACMHE is an initiative of the Center for Contemplative Mind in Society. I'd like to welcome you to our February 2020 Contemplative Education webinar, Fostering Belonging and Intercultural Engagement Through Contemplative Practices with Alexia Ferracuti. The webinar will begin with a reflective writing practice, so if you're able, grab a pen and paper to prepare, and if not, just follow along. Now I'd like to give you a little background about our presenter. Dr. Alexia Ferracuti is Senior Associate Director at Northeastern University's Center for Advancing Teaching and Learning through Research, where she develops and facilitates programming and services for faculty, staff, and students that promote reflection, inquiry, and inclusive pedagogy. She is especially interested in the integration of contemplative practices as they pertain to work related to fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly in the context of intercultural pedagogies, arts-based practices, and embodied forms of learning. Before joining Northeastern University, Alexia served as Assistant Director at Columbia University's Center for Teaching and Learning. Previously, she was Assistant Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Yale University, where she also earned her doctorate with distinction in Italian and Renaissance studies, with a research focus on comedy and performance. She has taught courses at Yale and Wesleyan in Italian, theater, and women, gender, and sexuality studies. We're extremely excited to have her here with us today. Please welcome Alexia.
Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to Maya and to the Association for Contemplative Mind and Higher Education for having me and for hosting our webinar today. I just want to say that C-Mind is an organization that has been nourishing me personally, spiritually, and professionally since I embarked in the work of supporting teaching and learning in higher ed, and especially in my educational development work around fostering equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I'm really, really honored to be joining you here today. And thank you to all of you for joining us for our discussion on fostering belonging and intercultural engagement through contemplative practices. I'm really looking forward to engaging your thoughts and reflections in our time together today. So our goals for today. We're going to explore the intersections between contemplative practices and intercultural approaches for creating inclusive learning environments, identify the ways in which contemplative practices can serve as means for developing and modeling educators' self-awareness and capacity for valuing differences among learners and ways of learning, and examine the relationship between mindfulness and engaging in critical reflection and dialogue around issues of social identity, positionality, and culture. So specifically, I'm going to be drawing from examples of programming I collaboratively designed with campus partners here at Northeastern to support university faculty, staff, and students in developing strategies for creating learning environments that foster belonging and mutual respect. And as Maya mentioned, I work in our university's Teaching and Learning Center, and I've been at Northeastern for almost 3 years now. And as I began to design and facilitate more programming and services supporting diversity and inclusive teaching, I began to reach out to campus partners to see how we could join forces in supporting inclusive learning environments on campus. And so as part of this programming, we engaged in contemplative practices, sometimes more implicitly, sometimes more explicitly, to help educators and learners interrogate biases, facilitate intercultural engagement, and ultimately make intentional, informed decisions that support equity and inclusion. So my hope is that today, in addition to discussing some guiding principles and specific methods for promoting inclusive environments through contemplative practices, I'm hoping to immerse you in a few of these practices firsthand and take time to consider how to implement them in your own contexts. I realize many of you might be in classrooms, others might be working in more co-curricular spaces or in faculty development, so hopefully there's something for everybody today. And I also want to introduce you to some frameworks for supporting educators in creating supportive learning environments, with the caveat that there are many, many great frameworks out there, and that I'll only be touching on a few that I have found to be particularly helpful and accessible when it comes to this work. So I'd like to begin with an opening practice. And if you have pencil, pen, paper in front of you, or if you'd like to type this, I invite you to go ahead and get something to write. And if you are not able to do so, or would rather just follow along without writing, you're welcome to do that as well. So I'd like to invite you to think back to a learning environment in which you felt like you belonged. So this might be a memory going back to elementary school. It might be something from your experience in college or graduate school. Maybe you're thinking of something that was not happening strictly in the classroom, but in which you still saw yourself as a learner. So go ahead and take a moment to think about a learning environment in which you felt like you belonged, and don't overthink this. And I'd like you to reflect on what was happening that made you feel like you belonged. And what did it feel like? How would you describe how it felt? And I want to emphasize that this is just for you. You will not be asked to share your responses in the chat or anything like that. So really take this time to reflect back on this. I'll give you a minute of silence to go ahead and do that. So go ahead and finish your thought, maybe take 10 more seconds or so. And now thinking or looking at, depending on whether you wrote or not, what you just reflected on, I'd like you to think about, in this experience, did any of your social identities come up? And what I mean by social identities are identities such as race, ethnicity, language, age, gender identity and expression, religion or spiritual practice, etc. That's certainly not all of our social identities. That's just some of them, sexual orientation. Did any of your social identities come up? And did any aspect related to what you would perceive as your cultural identities come up? So just give you a moment to think about that. And again, I want to emphasize that this is just for you and that you will not be asked to share your responses. So we'll be debriefing this a little bit, and I'll be referring back to elements of these prompts later as well. And I want to mention too that, of course, the way we perceive our cultural identities may well encompass many of our social identities. So of course, those are deeply related. And I also want to emphasize how much of this has to do with perception, right? How we perceive ourselves, how we perceive others perceiving us. There can be a lot of ambiguity in that and a lot of limits to what is visible as well. So when we belong, the kinds of things that we might think of might look something like, I matter. People care about me. I'm worthy. I feel part of a community because. Maybe this kind of language came to mind as you reflected on your own experience of belonging. And when we do not feel that we belong, our thoughts might look like, no one cares about me. What I do doesn't matter. I'm not worthy. I feel isolated. And so earlier when I asked you to think back on a time when you felt like you belonged, it may be the case that for some of you, a time when you felt like you did not belong may have actually come to mind, especially when we consider that often we become more conscious of our social identities in contexts where we feel marginalized or like we do not belong. And the fact is that a sense of belonging does have an impact on our ability to learn. And so at this point, I'm actually going to transition from debriefing our opening practice into talking more in depth about how belonging affects learning. So I'm going to ask Maya to go ahead and take the video of me away here, leaving us just with the projection of the slides so as to minimize distraction. Thank you. And once we move to Q&A at the end, I'll plan to have the video of me come back on for our Q&A discussion. So what are some of the ways belonging affects learning in the context of higher ed? College students' sense of belonging is linked to their academic performance and overall well-being in and beyond the classroom. And although everyone shares the need to belong, college students' perception of belonging can differ based on their identities and experiences, as well as their academic performance or preparation. In learning environments in which they feel they do not belong, students are less likely to be engaged. This is quite intuitive, right? However, when students learn that it is normal to experience academic struggle and that such struggle does not demonstrate their lack of belonging, they have improved academic outcomes compared with students who do not receive such messages. So that's to say there's a lot that we can do as educators to, for example, normalize academic struggle and to make it clear that the things that students might identify as contributing to whatever academic struggle they're experiencing are not intrinsic to aspects of who they are or aspects of their social identities. So this next slide is admittedly a big block of text. They won't all be like this, I promise, but I did want to offer it here in full because it's a passage I've used in my own programming as something to sit with, for participants to sit with. It's a passage from a book entitled Talking About Leaving, about why students leave STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, math disciplines. And the research shows that students often leave these disciplines not due to a lack of ability, but due to a lack of sense of belonging. So I'm going to read this passage slowly aloud. And as I do, feel free to follow along. And as I read it, I also invite you, again, if you have paper in front of you, you can write down or just mentally take note of particular words or phrases that strike you as particularly significant. So I'm going to go ahead and read the passage aloud. What it does to people is to weed them out psychologically. When people come in with inherent doubts about whether they are meant for the field, especially women and minority students, they don't have that base of self-confidence. They are less likely to tell themselves that everyone else is having the same problem because their confidence is more fragile. The teacher believes he is testing for ability, but in fact, he's testing for self-esteem and self-confidence. I don't think he consciously knows that, but it still has that effect. The weed-out system has side effects that professors are not aware of. They accept that they are losing people, but may not realize that they are losing people unevenly from different categories. They're fine with the fact that people are weeded out. They want a core of dedicated people, but what they're not realizing is that people are also being weeded out, not so much in terms of ability, but in terms of other qualities. So when I use this passage from a student in my workshops, I tend to frame it as a contemplative reading. I don't necessarily name that. I don't necessarily say we're about to do a contemplative reading. But what I mean by saying that I frame it as a contemplative reading is that I really scaffold the way that we engage with this reading. So typically first, I will have folks read it to themselves. And then either I, or even better, they go around the room, and I have essentially one person read one sentence at a time. And sometimes I'll number the side of the paragraph so that it's really obvious what sentence is next and what each person is reading. And what's helpful about that is that we get to hear multiple voices. We don't know what this student sounds like, so there's something powerful about hearing different voices read this passage aloud. And then I normally ask what words stand out, and I invite folks to simply voice these words or phrases aloud without contextualizing why they strike them. So here I've highlighted in yellow potential words or phrases that may have stood out to you, such as inherent doubts, fragile, ability, weed out system. And then this typically leads us into a more free-form discussion about how folks are interpreting this passage. Often people will refer to their own experiences as learners and observations as educators. And so I find that managing the stages of interaction with this passage, that is starting by only looking at the words and then reading it aloud as a group before getting into discussion, does lead to folks being more vulnerable and to a deeper and more open and meaningful discussion of the passage. Essentially, it allows us to hone in and listen to what this student in this passage is saying. And as I'll touch on later, this kind of technique of managing the stages of interaction is also a principle taken from the literature around intercultural pedagogy. So using something like that passage is a way of zooming in to the broader topic of creating a supportive learning environment, one that fosters a sense of belonging. And one way of thinking about this is in terms of what we might call climate. A concept I realize may be familiar to many of us, but I'll touch on it here just in case. And here I'm talking about course climate, but I also invite you to think of that in a very transferable way. We might talk about campus climate, we might talk about the climate of a learning environment more broadly. So when we think about course climate, what we're talking about is the sum of student and instructor behaviors and related student perceptions, again, this idea of perception, that influences the emotional and social experience of the class. And even in the most content-focused course, climate plays a dramatic role in what, how much, and how effectively our students are able to learn. So in thinking about STEM classes, for example, where the topic of identity per se is less likely to be featured as part of the course content, it is important to remember how much climate can impact students' performance in the class. So what more can we say about what supportive learning environments look like? In supportive learning environments, students report that instructors are non-judgmental, open, and respectful of others, as well as comfortable exploring conflict and controversy. Peers are also respectful and non-judgmental. They honestly share their thoughts and ideas and come together to create a community. So we can begin to see, with this emphasis on the ability to explore conflict and controversy, for example, or to share thoughts and ideas in a non-judgmental way as a community, how contemplative practices can serve as strategies or mechanisms for supporting a climate that fosters belonging. So much of what I've shared up till here is taken from what I've offered at Northeastern as part of the Fostering Belonging workshop series I co-developed with some of my dear, dear campus partners here. And this series was geared to educators writ large, meaning faculty, staff, and graduate students. This is just a little flyer, part of a flyer that we used for the series. When we brought this series on fostering belonging together, we did it with a shared sense of mission, as well as with a realistic understanding of what was feasible for each of our offices regarding bandwidth, regarding any additional undertaking. So what we decided on was for each office to offer a workshop that they either already offered on a regular basis, or that was an easy extension of their regularly offered programming. And we also thought that it was important to coordinate the scheduling of these sessions such that participants could come to one workshop, a standalone workshop, and get something out of that, or to all 4 workshops as a series, depending on their interest and availability. And so here you see the offices that were involved. The first is my center. And so I kicked off the series with the workshop on fostering an inclusive learning environment. Then we had the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion, who primarily serves staff and faculty on campus. They offered a workshop on recognizing and interrupting microaggressions. Then the LGBTQA Resource Center offered a workshop that they expanded on a workshop that they would offer quite regularly on names and pronouns and how those impact sense of belonging. And then finally, the last session in our series was offered by the Center for Intercultural Engagement, which is also a student-facing center. And that one focused on facilitating inclusion, specifically dialogue and intervention strategies. So I want to highlight that this was also a great opportunity for different offices to potentially reach audiences they did not normally reach on campus. As I said, for instance, the LGBTQA Resource Center, as well as the Center for Intercultural Engagement, are really primarily student-facing offices, and so it was a wonderful opportunity to bring their expertise and also their intimate understanding of student experiences to an educator audience on campus. What was great about this was that while we didn't have to sort of spend time sort of co-designing each workshop, which I think we would have loved to do, but we would not have had the time to do in our context, we did have to kind of sit down and think about what our collective goals for this series was. And so these are what we came up with. Our goals for this series were to explore circumstances and practices that can affect an environment of mutual respect, interrogate implicit biases and how their manifestations impact learning and development, and develop skills and strategies for facilitating an inclusive learning community. We were aware that, folks might just come to one session, but whether they came to one or to the whole series, our hope was that they would really try to do something when they went back to their respective contexts. So I want to just touch on some of the ways in which we integrated contemplative practices, whether it was implicit or explicit, as part of the series. In some cases, it was something like a contemplative reading practice. So the passage I shared with you featuring the student voice was part of my workshop on fostering an inclusive learning environment. Often we had things that were like a contemplative writing practice. Often these were free writes, and we framed them as free writes to invite people to not write in a way that they would judge their thoughts, but to really try to honestly reflect on something. Sometimes the prompts for these free writes would be more personal, much like the opening practice I guided you through at the beginning of our webinar on, for example, experiences of feeling a sense of belonging as a learner. And sometimes they were less personal, certainly could still be imbued with a lot of personal experience, but more about, for example, maybe definitions. How would you define an inclusive learning environment? We would use something like that as a prompt. And then there were times when this might be scaffolded into a mindful listening practice. So, one of the things I've always loved about these practices is the way that they can meaningfully be combined depending on what outcome you're trying to design for and what kind of experience you're trying to create for learners or for participants. And so with that in mind, I did want to touch on just a few considerations actually for facilitating contemplative writing and listening that I've come to realize are really important to also respect the kinds of personal experiences that we might ask folks to be reflecting on in these contexts. So the first is really to be intentional about the purpose of the reflection, right? To really think of what are we trying to get out of this reflection for folks. And so to that end, thinking about the prompts, how to craft the prompts, and whether it makes sense for the prompt to be personal or impersonal. As I mentioned earlier, is it more of a definition or is it more going back to a personal experience? And this has a lot to do with sharing these reflections, or really whether they will be shared at all. So that's to say, it's important to think about who the audience would be for these reflections. Is it just for themselves to reflect on, especially if it is something more personal? Is it something that folks might write down and share with you as the instructor or facilitator? Is it something that they might share with maybe one other person in something like an active listening or mindful listening exercise? Or is it something that could potentially be shared with the whole group? And so I think that, and I'm happy to touch on this later in our Q&A as well, really thinking carefully through these facilitation approaches is important and helps us be really mindful about when we craft the kinds of prompts we do for reflection and thinking about what is this really for, and do we want to prioritize it being something just for that person to think back on something, or is it something that is important to share with others in that context. So then one of the things that grew out of the Fostering Belonging workshop series, which we started a couple of years ago, was an inquiry group, or what in other contexts might be called a learning community, on intercultural pedagogy. And this is something that we offered for the first time this past fall. And we held it in the teaching center, in my center here, and I co-facilitated it with one of my Fostering Belonging collaborators, the director of the Center for Intercultural Engagement, which is, again, a primarily student-facing office. And we developed this learning community out of a desire to work with a cohort of educators over the course of a semester to support them in implementing inclusive strategies in their curricula. Because, you know, as much as we, with the Fostering Belonging series, wanted to make it easy for folks to maybe just come for a short lunchtime session, you know, maybe they would come to more than one workshop, we wanted to really have the opportunity to bring together a community of folks who could iterate on what they do as educators and to have the space and time to do that more deeply. We ended up having 16 participants for this inquiry group, which was actually really large for us. And we had a waiting list. It was really exciting to see that there was a lot of interest on campus for this. And that group consisted of a combination of faculty, staff, and graduate students. A few details. This is the book we used. This is a book from 2017, so it's nice that it's quite a recent book. I'm happy to talk about the book in more detail later if anyone's curious about my thoughts on it. Overall, it was a good book. I'm not sure, I mean, it was a great book in many ways. There's just so many wonderful frameworks on intercultural pedagogy out there, so that's the only thing that made it hard. Our goal in this group, again, was really to explore interculturally informed approaches for creating inclusive learning environments. So you might be wondering, why did we choose an intercultural framework? And we thought that an intercultural framework to inclusive teaching would not only be meaningful, but would also be a relatively accessible way in engaging folks with this work. And of course, my colleague, Karin, being the director of the Center for Intercultural Engagement, it was a natural fit in that sense as well, also given some of my background as well. We met 6 times, once every 2 weeks over the course of the semester. And we also had folks reflect. They had sort of journal entries that they worked on and shared in between meetings. And we really tried to put a lot of emphasis on not only reflecting, but on what are you doing, what are you going back to your context and doing, and then coming back and sharing how that went, and also celebrating, you know, the risk taking, because, you know, sometimes things would not obviously go exactly as hoped or planned when they would try different things out in their respective contexts. So I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about what does it mean, or what do I mean here, at least when I'm talking about teaching interculturally. And when it comes to defining what we mean by teaching interculturally, I am going to offer something in the way of a definition in the following slides, but really with the caveat that there are so many fantastic frameworks out there on the subject. I'm just going to be highlighting a few here. So teaching interculturally really means acknowledging and supporting the learning of students who are linguistically, culturally, socially, or in other ways different from the instructor or from each other across a very wide definition of perceived difference and group identity. It also means engaging students effectively in global learning, or the engagement with complex interdependent systems and legacies and their implications for people's lives and the Earth's sustainability. Furthermore, it really speaks to the commitment, not just the desire, so really emphasizing action here, implementation, to making intentional, informed decisions that enable learning experiences to engage and support diversity and inclusion. And finally, it involves cultivating skills at foundational, facilitation, and curriculum design levels. And I'm going to be going into those in more detail in just a minute. I wanted to share some values or guiding principles that the book that we used outlined. And they borrow from the language of Laura Rendon, the author of Senti Pensante, in calling these new agreements. And what they mean by new agreements are really mindfully developed values that shape our action. So I'm calling them guiding principles here. So these guiding principles are to pursue equity and inclusion, to recognize that expertise is fluid and developmental. And that's important, I think, especially because this work can be very intimidating, to understand that this is really lifelong learning, that no one is ever really done with this work. You never really get to tick the box, like check it off the list, that it's really an ongoing development that we undertake as educators. And that it's a process that relies on fostering reflection and revision. And so one of the things I really appreciated about the book, the way the book Teaching Interculturally talks about this, is that they're talking about revision also in terms of revisioning. That is to say that it takes a new vision, an awakened sensibility to teaching. And again, this goes back to the idea of what we might think of as a beginner's mind, where, you know, this is a developmental process that we're talking about. So all of this is really important and serves as sort of a moral compass, but such principles can also seem somewhat abstract, and especially for faculty who often wish to know how this translates to tangible teaching strategies. And so this is where another related framework comes in that I have found really helpful in this context. And the authors of this framework talk about it in terms of it being a set of intercultural teaching competencies. And the word competency makes me bristle a little bit. So I actually prefer talking about them as skills. I think that the emphasis with competency is that we can have a growth mindset about developing these. These are things that we can develop. And so in this framework, the authors talk about these three levels. They talk about foundational skills, and the foundational skills focus on an educator's own self-awareness and the ability to model intercultural learning for students. So it really starts there with critical self-reflection on the educator's part. Then there's the level of facilitation skills, which build on foundational skills and allow educators to interact with students and encourage interaction among students in ways that are respectful of diversity. And then finally, there's curriculum design skills. And these reflect the skills of educators who not only respond to diversity in their learning environments sort of in real time, as we might think of with facilitation, but also intentionally engage students in global and intercultural learning activities or discussions of social justice issues in order to promote global learning outcomes. So I'm going to get a little bit more in detail about these different levels in a moment, but a general thing I always say about these is that it's just helpful to be thinking about all three, to be able to think, okay, maybe I'm thinking about this primarily at the facilitation level, but what can I do on a more foundational level? Or what might I do when it comes to actually revising my curriculum? And so it's just important to think about how we are enacting these strategies at different levels. And the other thing I also tend to emphasize is that we cannot skip that first level, that foundational level. It's called that for a reason, and that it really acknowledges our own identities and experiences and how these may have shaped our practices as educators. So with these foundational skills, I want to, on the following slides, sort of outline the ways in which we engage contemplative practices in order to support sort of these different levels. So this first category of foundational skills has a lot to do with reflection and critical self-inquiry, which often leads to a greater understanding of one's own biases and experiences and how these might impact what you do and who you are as an educator. So some of the contemplative practices we engaged in to address these foundational skills, and this was again in the inquiry group, was over the course of several of our meetings, we had this scaffolded self-inquiry activity on identity and positionality, specifically considering one's own social identities. And there were a lot of parts of that process that were important to consider carefully in terms of pieces of the reflections that we wanted to make sure were just going to be for individual participants, just for themselves essentially, and other kinds of prompts that we used to have people share out what they got from that process. So in other words, to share out on a more meta level what they may have gotten from this kind of reflection, but to not be put on the spot to divulge maybe particular aspects of their experiences and identities. And so that was something that we scaffolded and sort of touched on during multiple sessions, and it eventually built into another activity that involved an identity map that continued the self-reflection on identity and positionality. But this time, it put it in the context of the educator's perception of students, and also vice versa, how they think they might be perceived by students. And again, so much of this theme of perception is really important to sort of break down, because we might be getting feedback from students where we can point to like this is what my students have said about me, but in a lot of instances it's about sort of our assumptions about how we're being perceived. And so a lot of this process involves critically reflecting on our perceptions and our assumptions. And so in the inquiry group, these contemplative practices were opportunities to really draw on this kind of critical self-reflection in a deeper way and over the course of several weeks, which is something that would have been really hard to do in a shorter amount of time. So in terms of facilitation skills, the second level, this in some ways is the most intuitive, not only in reflecting the way educators often think about inclusively engaging their students, that is in space and in real time. But also for us as facilitators of the inquiry group, this was sort of a natural way for us to think about, okay, what can we be doing with our participants in the group that might model practices that they might do with their students or with their learners, depending on what their context was. And what starts to become really interesting to me, at least, and I'm really curious to hear folks' thoughts when we move to Q&A, is that these practices are really both contemplative and intercultural. When you get familiar with the literature, they really start overlapping in ways that I find really exciting, actually. So to give you a sense of what I mean, so these are some of the practices we integrated at what I would call the facilitation level. And again, these might strike you as more contemplative practices, or for some of you, they might be something that you relate more to being intercultural approaches. So some of the things we did was to invite mindful behavior. So we did things like community agreements at the beginning of the series, sort of setting ground rules. There was a certain kind of pace that we used to speak. And so we really wanted to facilitate conditions to support inclusive dialogue, to make sure that everyone was heard, kind of structuring our time together so that there were times where we asked everybody to share something. We tried to make those instances relatively low stakes for people when we were asking everybody to say something. We also, as I kind of drew out earlier, managed the stages of interaction, meaning we tried to really scaffold our dialogue together. So we wouldn't just move into like, okay, let's discuss what the chapter said about this concept, but rather for example, there was one time when I asked everybody to bring in or to send us passages from the chapter we had read that really struck them. And so then I basically cut those up and put them in a little box and had everybody draw out one and read it aloud. So that kind of functioned as a contemplative reading practice and was a way to like kind of ease into a more free-form conversation about what they had gained from the chapter. And this is obviously related to the previous two, but incorporating silence and also welcoming different styles of communication. So we also would like draw pictures. We have whiteboard walls in the space that we used for this. So we thought it was important to make sure that we were engaging in different forms of communication as well. And so it goes without saying that I think a lot of these kinds of practices were things that folks felt like, okay, I've gotten to experience this, and I can see what it feels like, and I can ask my students maybe to do this if it's something that I thought was helpful and meaningful. So this was really useful for us in terms of modeling these kinds of facilitation practices. And then finally, with skills pertaining more to curriculum design, what I really try to emphasize with this level is that a lot of the important work happens here. This is really where educators embed and integrate inclusive pedagogy in ways that are locked into the design of what they do at the level of learning outcomes and aligned activities, projects, materials, etc. So really, to me, a keyword here is integration, where it's not like you're thinking of an inclusive practice as something extra or additional that you're going to sort of tack on to what you already do, but how can you embed this in the kinds of things you already do, right? So when we think about revision, certainly there may be times where we decide to overhaul a curriculum, for example, but we wanted to emphasize that you can also start small and just change aspects of the things that you already do so that it feels more woven in and also less intimidating and therefore more sustainable and realistic to continue in the future. So some of the ways we integrated contemplative practices to support intercultural curriculum design in the inquiry group, where we had folks reflect on developing and refining their learning outcomes to make them be intercultural learning outcomes. And with learning outcomes, you know, I imagine many folks joining us here are familiar with the concept of constructive alignment or backward design, where the idea is that you really start with learning outcomes and work backward from there so that you're really trying to make those the goals. So if your goal is to create, for example, an intercultural learning environment, how can you keep yourself accountable to that? You know, and that's really where design the learning outcomes to speak to that comes in. Another activity that we engaged in was a silent conversation to help one another revise their curriculum. So for those of you who are not familiar with what I mean here by silent conversation, it's a way of communicating through writing, so no speaking. And again, our space that we used has whiteboard walls. And so we asked participants to write what we called their interculturalizing action. Again, we wanted to emphasize, what are you actually doing in your space? And we also said, okay, so now come back next time and tell us what that action was, how it went, and then get feedback and ideas from one another for future revision and implementation. And so I just wanted to share a couple of pictures of what this silent conversation looked like. So you'll see there's sort of the main text of what that educator may have written about the context of what they did, what the action was, how it went. And then you see sort of in other colors with like images and writing, folks have gone around and commented like, oh, that's great. Oh, and maybe you can think about doing this next time. And that sort of thing. And of course, the hope is that along the way, you're picking up ideas from others. So, you know, again, this is a discussion that could easily be held in a more traditional way, but doing it in this silent conversation mode is a way of engaging in a more intercultural and contemplative practice. So I really want to just leave you with some of the overarching connections that I see, at least, between inclusive and contemplative practices. And the fact that these can blur together is, to my mind, such a productive thing, especially considering that everyone comes to this work through different entry points. So some of the overarching themes and practices that I see, and maybe these resonate with you as well, are unlearning, beginner's mind, fostering attitudes of curiosity and openness, comfort with ambiguity, comfort with discomfort, empathy, engaging silence, and creating a space in which mindful attention is really imbuing that space. Creating space and conditions for critical self-inquiry and emphasizing first-person reflections and experiences. Emphasizing listening as participation, deep and mindful listening. Managing stages of interaction, questioning, perspective taking, and finally, welcoming different forms of communication and expression. So I hope this might be generative and that perhaps there are connections here that resonate with you, or that there are further intersections you might share with us as we move into some Q&A. I'm also happy to help think through ways of going about developing these kinds of collaborations, or ideas around integrating specific kinds of contemplative practices into this work. But before we move to Q&A, I just want to show you my references here. Sorry, the font is so small. There's many references and I put them all in one slide. And I want to sincerely thank you all for your time and attention today. I'm going to turn it to Maya now to see what questions there are in the time that remains, and maybe ask her to turn my video back on here too. And what I might do is go back to the slide I had earlier in case it sparks thoughts for folks.
Thank you so much, Alexia. Now we can
Thank
see you again.
Great.
So thank you for sharing this work with us. And as Alexia mentioned, this is now a good time to submit your questions so that we can all hear them and hear Alexia's responses. I know some folks have been submitting questions throughout, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. And I'm actually already seeing someone requesting to have your reference slide be put back up.
Oh, sure.
And I just want to remind everyone that the webinar is recorded and will be sent to you, so you can refer back to this page if you want to in the recording as well. So I'm just going to give a moment or two for folks to submit questions.
Sure. Sounds good.
So I think the question that we'll get started with is about providing some concrete examples of practices that you might use in respecting diversity and allowing for intercultural conversation. So some concrete examples of how you might do that.
Can you repeat of how you might, what was the exact, what came after, did you say respecting diversity?
Respecting diversity and allowing for intercultural conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Some on-the-ground practices.
Yeah, I mean, I know this might sound repetitive, but I do think there's a reason that I would recommend always starting with introspection. You know, I think in academia, we are very trained to think in a third person sort of way. And that might also be expressed in terms of objective truths, and that's also potentially very informed by our own disciplinary background, not to mention our cultural backgrounds potentially as well. And so I think that it can feel like a bit of a different practice to be asked to be both still part of your sort of campus community in something like a workshop that I might run, and yet be engaging in a different kind of practice than what you might be used to, say, in, you know, a faculty meeting or something, where you're asked to think about, for example, your experience as a learner. And so I think a big thing I think about with prompts in those kinds of reflections is to start in a way that doesn't put anyone on the spot in terms of thinking about particular experiences, but really making it about, for example, like how would you define, you know, how would you describe an inclusive learning environment? Because that might look really different for different people. And so, you know, I also have my positionality and set of identities as a facilitator. And so I might have my assumptions and what I'm deriving from the literature around how to define that, but to really be able to find ways to bring the voices that are in the room so that what folks are able to reflect on and then share in a careful way with each other is really informing everyone's thinking and is able to be voiced. So I'm hearing the need for something practical, but I would say whatever it is, really starting with that. And so when I talked earlier about the identity map, what that kind of looks like is, and this is a quite common practice in some ways, is often it's represented as a wheel, and folks are asked to think about what their social identities are and maybe other aspects of their identities to sort of differentiate between, like, what do we mean by social identity versus maybe other things like your taste in music or what have you, like those things that are not your social identity but are important parts of who you are. And then to scaffold that into what might that mean in terms of how you have experienced a learning environment in which you belong, because ultimately, to a greater or lesser degree, we all of us have a set of marginalized and privileged identities. It's just that we might not have been guided in a practice to think about what those are. So I think what can be difficult, but also is really important to remember, is that that foundational level might not feel like the one that has the most concrete takeaways, but it's so important to start there. And so to start with practices that really engage in that kind of critical self-reflection, where people get to reflect on their own identities and experiences, and hopefully as a facilitator or as an instructor, thinking about how you're going to bring those into the space. And that's really nuanced work. So depending on what you're doing that reflection for and how explicitly aligns with your learning outcomes, thinking about what then gets shared in the space. So I hope that's helpful. It was a big question.
Yes, I chose it for that reason. So
Yes.
yeah,
No.
thank you so much.
It's an important question.
Yeah. The next question is one that comes up a lot, I think, when talking about doing this kind of work and within an institution, and is asking what your experience has been in communicating the importance of how upper university administrative decisions or lack thereof affect students, especially those with marginalized identities, sense of belonging, or even safety to their campus and community. Is this something with which you have had experience with?
So the thing that comes to mind there is that, obviously, institutionally, we are all sort of ultimately part of some kind of hierarchical institution, right? Which is also to say that, in supporting, for example, a more inclusive campus, different offices are positioned differently. And so I think something that was really, really helpful and meaningful for me, for example, in the Fostering Belonging series, was to come together with other offices, and specifically with the offices that, like 2 out of the 4 offices that came together for that, were student-facing offices. So they might be much more aware of how students are being directly impacted than I might be as someone who is in an office that primarily serves faculty, staff, graduate students, and all in a capacity as educators. And so while that might not always translate into naming what is happening at the higher levels of the institution, being able to bring people together who sort of are tasked with not only serving different audiences, but can really speak to and represent different experiences, and so specifically student population, that was really important, and I think was a valuable thing for the educators, our participants as well, because they might not in the past have had such direct rapport with those offices who are serving students, especially students of marginalized identities. So that's what I would say. So it's almost like, on one hand, we can't totally get away from the silos that exist within a hierarchical institution. And yet when you identify a common mission and frame it in a way that is going to work, and that that you have a sense, that there's a need as well, I think different offices can sort of touch on what might be happening institutionally in different ways and with different sort of kinds of authority.
Yeah.
It is important to, I think it's an acknowledgement that, you know, it's a way of addressing those needs in a way that on our own, in our own units, we might not be able to do. But I think that at the very least, that's a reason to collaborate, and specifically to try to find collaborators who serve different constituencies of, you know, at a given institution.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So someone asked if you could return to the slide that had your contact information on it.
Absolutely. And do please reach out with questions or ideas. You know, this is work that, you know, I really mean what I'm saying about lifelong learning. You know, I feel so honored and privileged to be doing this work, but I am also always learning. And so I'm always happy to connect to people who are doing this work as well, of course.
Thank you so much for that invitation to folks. I think this might have to be our last question. And just for folks who didn't have their questions answered, I wanted to let you know that I will be downloading all of these questions and sharing with them with Alexia post broadcast. So
Great.
they will not go unanswered. I just lost the question I was going to ask. I apologize. Oh, okay. So this question is about resources and education on intercultural competence and cultural humility, which this individual has found that most of the resources they are working with are implicitly aimed at white students, and that being that she teaches, or they teach in an increasingly diverse classroom, they're looking for more inclusive resources. I'm not sure if there's any on your resource page that you would suggest.
That's a great question. I think specifically, it's only because as a faculty developer, I'm usually looking at, you know, it's sort of about serving maybe faculty. So I don't know as immediately about resources that would speak to how to think about different student identity audiences in that sense. But I'll think about that, and please, like, that person, please feel free to reach out to me. One thing I will say is that another framework that I didn't touch on at all today does kind of inform how I was talking about global learning. But when we think about this from a framework of intercultural, like of global citizenship, and something that would be through a more democratic lens, a really important point of that is how this work is work that we can do in our own context here and now, but that also, even when folks talk about that work, it can sound very monolithic and make assumptions about, you know, whatever this monolithic student might be, maybe, you know, attributing majority identities to that student. And so again, this is where I would say it's really important to think about the ways in which we can get feedback and information, basically find ways of learning from our students, how they identify, how they self-identify, and bringing that in, because, you know, there are aspects of diversity that are not going to be as visible. And then also for the folks who feel like there are aspects that where they really feel like they are marginalized and stand out as such, to have ways to hear from everybody, so that it's not just based on the assumptions that we have as educators. But I wish I had a particular, you know, resource that I could call out. But I would say the framework around sort of global learning in terms of global citizenship or intercultural competence for students is a way of understanding that we should not rest on some kind of monolithic idea of who our students are, or default to thinking of them as, you know, American and with a set of majority identities. So I think it's something that's embedded in different frameworks. So I would say, when looking into it, thinking about which framework speaks to that best, And so it may well be that the work around global learning in that respect, global citizenship, and specifically taking a democratic lens to education will speak to that.
Thank you so much, Alexia.
Thank you.
So I want to thank you again for sharing your work with us today, and thanking all of our attendees today for joining us. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the website soon. Our webinars are made possible by your support, so we invite you to make a donation and check out our extensive webinar archive at www.contemplativemind.org. I also wanted to quickly share that registration for the 2020 summer session is now open. We're very excited about that. To learn more about that program, you can visit contemplativemind.org/summer. You may not be aware of this since we have such a wide reach, but in actuality, the Center for Contemplative Mind is just 3 full-time staff members. Your donations really do make a difference no matter what the size. Thank you, Alexia, and thank you all
so
for
much,
listening.
Maya. Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.